today we have a repeat presenter. So actually going back probably 2 years, Dr. Robert Malkin presented to our regional group and it was very well received. And then this past spring, we had a larger presentation for anyone in IECA who was interested, and that focused on how to find how to find lab research positions locally or somewhere near where you can live or access a university. And there was a lot of interest in learning more about the specific program he offers and founded and helps run, I should say, IRI for short, but it stands for International Research Institute of North Carolina. So we've invited him back to speak. If you've seen his past presentation, you'll have a little more background. If you haven't, all of those are recorded, and in the invitation, there was a link to the one about how to get a lab research position for a high school student. So by way of introduction, Dr. Malkin is currently a professor of the practice of biomedical engineering at Duke University, and he's also a professor of global health emeritus. He started his studies by earning a BS in electrical engineering at the University of Michigan in the days when one could get in there, and it's become impossible now. He then embarked on a series of very interesting international experiences, like teaching English in Thailand, designing integrated circuits at a microelectronics company in Switzerland, and designing pacemakers and heart-lung machines at several companies. So he has a lot of unique and different experiences. He made his way to Duke for graduate work in electrical engineering and got a PhD in '93. He has since received many, many awards for his research, his innovations, his teaching, and even for his service. He also founded several academies aimed at improving healthcare in developing countries and served as an expert advisor to the World Health Organization's Health Technology Group. So I continue to be amazed at the number of different things he's worked on, but it really comes as no surprise that when the pandemic hit, he thought about how he could help students access remote research through Duke and the connections that he has. And he started IRI to help make that possible. We also have another member of the IRI team here today, who is Angela Para, the current director of IRI, and she will speak later in the presentation. So let me start by introducing and welcoming Dr. Robert Malkin.
Thank you very much, Tina. Thank you. And thank you everybody for coming. I really appreciate your time today. We will be talking about, first of all, some just generalities of research and remote research, and then we'll definitely get into IRI specifically. If I could ask, could you just mute your microphone? We'll definitely have an opportunity for questions at the end. Either you can unmute your microphone at the end or put them in the chat window as well at the end. We'll try to get to every question that gets typed into the chat window. So as Tina said, my name is Bob Malkin. I'm a professor of the practice emeritus at Duke University in biomedical engineering and global health. And I'm also the director and founder of the International Research Institute of North Carolina. So I wanted to, and we will be talking about research. As probably all you know, the article in Chronicle of Higher Education kind of drove it home a few weeks ago. University admissions offices now seem to favor research. Harvard said substantial scholarship can elevate an application. UPenn claimed in a blog post nearly a third showed research. Yale, Columbia, and Brown are all encouraging research. So this brings up a couple of questions, like what type of research and why? Why is this so important to universities? Why do we care? So let's talk about, first of all, what kind of research we're talking about. This is the same whether it's an in-person lab or a remote lab. What we're talking about is academic research. This is also called scholarly research sometimes. Scholarly research or academic research is different than maybe professional research you might have done, or perhaps classroom research that your clients might have done, in a few ways. First of all, it has to be systematic. And by systematic, I mean it needs a method. The idea here is that your method description should be so specific that I could actually reproduce the work based on just your method. And that goes even for a literature review. You should provide details about the methods used. The work should be using primary sources. Primary sources differs from field to field, but it is not, for example, Google or Wikipedia or other review articles or popular magazines. In general, things like journals, in written hand journals, diaries. It can mean scientific journal articles. Basically, if you're working with a mentor, they're going to know what a primary source is in their field. And finally, and especially for high school students, a formal write-up is required. Usually a formal write-up is something very specific and traceable. So as an example, if I say there's a lot of birds that pass through Peanut Islands in Florida each year, that is neither specific nor is it traceable. So that would not be an example of scholarly writing. If I said Malkin in 1994 reported that 294 species of bird land on Peanut Island during migration season, that's both specific and traceable and would be an example of academic writing. So these are the three key things that we're going to be looking for in academic research as opposed to other types of research. Why bother with it? So why do we care? Why do universities care about this at all? Well, I can tell you, as the person directing research, we hope that the reason is because the students enjoy research. They like being the expert in the field. They like being able to tell people they know something. So of course, that's not the only reason that students do it. Also, sharpen critical reasoning skills. All, or maybe not all, but certainly it seems like all of science is about critical reasoning. And this is very important for my classroom as well, and therefore very important for university applications. We want students who can critically reason. Also, there are research-specific skills. Research is very detail-oriented. It requires work in a team. Again, very important for success in my classroom, just as it is in research, and excellent communication skills. Sometimes this one is overlooked. Remember, I teach engineering at Duke. Nevertheless, my students need excellent communication skills to be able to survive in an active, engaging classroom. So these are all also things looked for in college applications. So it's very important for both the students as a personal development, but it's also important for college applications. So let's talk about, first of all, what is the goal? And I want to talk outside of this topic, if I can just for a moment. The goal is actually an in-person laboratory position. I want to make it clear, even though I represent an organization that does remote research, that's not the goal. The goal is an in-person, in-lab job, just like in our own lives, your own life. You probably enjoy your interactions with people more when they're face-to-face than when you're on a Zoom call or a telephone call or whatever, texting. That's true for a lab job as well. Students will handle it better and they'll enjoy it more. So the goal is an in-person lab job. These are very difficult to find, even a volunteer. The money actually isn't really any factor in finding these jobs. They are just very difficult. And as Tina mentioned, the previous talk I gave is available on IRI's YouTube channel, and you can go watch that anytime you want. That's a detailed talk about how to find these in-person jobs. But they are very difficult. They're very difficult to find. And so a backup is a remote lab. And that's the way you should be approaching it, is that it is a backup. In other words, failure is an option in this case. You really need to make it clear to your students, this can be very difficult to do. It can be very difficult to find an in-person lab job. So for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to define an in-person lab. I'm sorry, I'm going to define a remote, I'm going to define a remote lab position. I haven't actually found a good definition, but I'm going to define it as any kind of research, meaning academic research, that a student is engaged in where they have no physical meetings with mentors. There are other models, which are blended models, and it's actually pretty common, where you have a little bit of remote, a little bit in person. I'm going to call those in person because from the faculty point of view, if you're on my campus for a minute under my supervision, I got to complete all the paperwork as if you were on my campus for an hour or a day or a year. So from my perspective, if you ever come onto my campus, you are an in-person lab person, not remote. So for this one, for today's talk, I'm only going to talk about 100% remote, no physical meetings with the mentor. According to this ProPublica article, which was published in the Chronicle of Higher Education last month, that's 12,000 students a year, a pretty small fraction of all the high school students, even in the US, and that's 12,000 around the world. So it's a pretty small fraction. But one of the surprising things to me was huge range of costs from just a couple $1,000s, according to ProPublica, to $10,000. In fact, IRI has a program as low as less than $1,000. So that's a range of tenfold in cost. In other words, you're shopping for something which has a huge range in cost. And a reasonable question is, does it have a huge range in value? So now I want to talk about that. I want to kind of talk about, is this value? Is there value here? And more importantly, I think, how do you ensure that your student's selection has value? The organization they're working with or the remote position they've selected has value. By far, for sure, the most common, let's say, concern that I get from parents and maybe occasionally from high school students is this has really got to limit the kind of research. In other words, in parents' heads anyways, mostly, research is done with your eyes glued to a microscope. That is research. You're wearing a white gown, you're mixing smelly chemicals, and you're wearing gloves and all that. And absolutely, that is a type of research. There's no question that that's a type of research. But it is by far not the only research. There's lots of other research types which can be done remotely. So just kind of summarize that point before I go on. In a sense, the parents' concerns are valid. There are limits to the type of research that can be done remotely. My argument is that's actually not the point. You kind of missed the point. The point was what I mentioned earlier: critical reasoning skills, working in a team, perhaps the chance to publish something. Some of these other outcomes are far more important than the student learn a particular method, a particular type. Now, when they get to be graduate students, 10 years later, maybe a little bit more even, okay, that's fine. Then they want to focus on a particular method. They're particularly interested in tunneling electron microscopy or whatever, that's fine. But at this age, I just don't think it's that relevant. And I just want to give you a couple quick examples to, I think, make my point. This is a paper that I published with a high school student. She's actually now a student at Duke University, but when I published with her, she was a high school student, on the effect of vaping on the immune system. So Sanjana surveyed, I believe, 1,000 or maybe it was 2,000 people about their vaping habits and their cold and flu symptoms as a surrogate for the immune system, and indeed showed that people who vape have more colds and flus, and people who vape more have worse cold and flu symptoms. So this was a really excellent piece of research. It was published in a pretty good journal and done completely remotely. I actually never met Sanjana until she came to campus. Coincidentally, she came to my campus. We did the entire thing remotely. Here's another one that I published with another high school student. He's now graduated, actually. He's just on his way to college. But he just graduated, just graduated 2 weeks ago. And this was an exoskeleton. So he did a lot of the work with the local high school's print shop for 3D printing some of these things. But we worked together on, polishing up the research and getting it published. And actually, I have never met Ashwin in person. All of our interactions have been remote. Just trying to point out it can be done. There are definitely limits. Parents' concerns are valid here, but I kind of think they're missing the point. At this point in a person's research career, what they're trying to do is just learn about research, learn about what research is and gain some of the skills, not really focus in on a particular method, which they may not be able to do remotely. However, that doesn't mean that everything goes. There are a few key points that I want you to consider when you're placing a high school student in a remote research position, no matter what organization they're working with. I do want to point out, as Tina mentioned, and I think I mentioned already, I am the academic director at IRI, so of course I have a particular point of view, and I'll be sharing my point of view here. First of all, mentorship. I really feel that your high school students should be working with a professor. By that, I mean a professor with a capital P, not professor with a little p. That means something else. Capital P professor. There are 3 ranks of professors at universities: assistant professor, associate professor, and the rank is called professor, although usually it's referred to as full professor, though the title is professor. And they go in this order. So a younger faculty member will be an assistant professor, then they'll become an associate professor, then they'll become a full professor. At that point, their title will just say professor, as mine does. You really do want to watch out for this. There are plenty of other titles at universities. The most common ones you'll encounter are graduate student, PhD. PhD is someone who has a PhD, but does not have mentorship experience. PhD student, it's obvious, they're a student trying to get a PhD. Again, these can be wonderful people. It's not that these people aren't wonderful, and perhaps they're great at mentorship as well, but they don't have any experience. The thing about an assistant, associate, or full professor, they're going to have experience. They're going to have experience writing letters of recommendation. They're going to have experience making phone calls afterwards. And I have a different talk, which I may give someday, on making the most out of your research position. But there's a lot that a professor, an experienced professor, can do to help your client. They have a lot of connections. They have deep networks. There's also candidate. I don't think I mentioned candidate. I'm not actually sure what that means. There isn't a university, as far as I know, there isn't a university-wide category of candidate. But it certainly doesn't mean that they're an assistant professor, associate professor, full professor. Those are the ones that you're looking for. I really feel your student's going to have a better experience. There are 2 different program types. Unfortunately, in the industry, that is the remote research industry, it's become, I think, overly complicated. I'm just going to call them introductory and in-depth. An introductory program is anything that's less than 6 months. Generally, the deliverable is going to be literature review. If you're familiar with research, you know that the first 2 steps of everybody's research, everybody, always, is figure out what your question is and then do a literature review. Basically, what am I interested in and what have other people done in this field? So this is the first 2 steps, and that's why I call it introductory. It's a great place to start. These are great programs, especially for students who don't have a background in research. This is a great place to get started. And then there's in-depth programs. Keep in mind, these are high school students. I have graduate students in my lab that stay with me for 7 years, 6 years, 5 years. I'm not talking about that. These are high school students, so that it's not going to be that level of in-depth. But you should be looking at 1 to 2 years for a high school student to be doing an in-depth piece of work. Generally, the student should be looking at publication as, and I'll talk more about publication in a moment. Generally, they should be looking for publication as the result of in-depth, either first authored or some other position, second or third author most typically. Unfortunately, in the industry, there's become this proliferation of names like advanced in-depth research, and it's a 4-week program, or an in-depth study of, and it's a 6-week program. My recommendation is just forget about the names. Just the names just don't mean anything at that point. If it's a short program, it's an introductory program. If it's a much longer program, it's an in-depth program. And you should be expecting different deliverables for short programs than in-depth programs. There are 2 general formats, individual and group. It's exactly what it sounds like. There are great reasons to do both. There's not that one is good or one is bad. Individual, of course, one-on-one. Group meaning 2 or more on the same or similar topics. Not always, actually. Some group are even on multiple topics. No problem for either of these. They're both great programs. Just keep in mind, you're going to have a lot more faculty, your students going to have a lot more faculty contact if they're doing a one-on-one. I meet with my students one-on-one, 1 hour per week. I know a lot about them. If they put up a new poster in their room, I know about their room. I know what their poster looks like. So we talk about it. I really get to know the students. In groups, it's much more difficult. I try to do that, but I had a group of 8 yesterday working with them on something. And I think I remember all of their names. It's just harder. It's harder for me. That was our first meeting, you know, of course, over time, I'll build a relationship with them, but it's not going to be as good as the one-on-one. Otherwise, don't worry about it. One small thing, this is pretty rare, but I do occasionally come across it. Your students still need to have independence of thought. So it's fine to work in a group, but they need to have their own territory, one way or another, that you can identify. So you should be able to ask them about what the group is doing, but you should be able to ask them, what are you doing specifically? Describe to me your part of that. And they should be able to easily and clearly differentiate their component from everybody else's in the group. All right, let's talk about publication. There's a lot of buzz about publication. It was covered in the ProPublica article quite a bit, and for good reason. This is a really challenging area. I intend to develop a full talk on just this one area someday. Today, I'm only going to give you just a couple slides here. This is a difficult area. First of all, publication does matter. A publication is very important in the research world. Publication is how we share research, and research that you keep secret isn't actually research. Remember, it always involves some sort of write-up, and for a high school student, it's probably going to be a formal written write-up. Unfortunately, what some people have told me is, well, you know, I'm not going to have my high school student pay for publication. Well, let me tell you, I've published in Lancet, I've published in other very top-end journals, you got to pay. Unfortunately, just paying to be published is not a differentiator. So the fact that your student has to pay a publication fee, that one fact by itself, you can't really use as a differentiator. I think PLOS One is now $1,900. So publication fees actually can be quite expensive even. Not necessarily a differentiator though. Now here is something that is a differentiator. There are junior science journals and private label journals. Junior science journals generally are labeled that way. So they'll say the High School Journal of, or the Young Scientists Journal of, or the Journal of High School Research, or something like that. So they're pretty usually identifiable by name. And private label, unfortunately, are not identifiable by name easily, but private label journals are owned by usually for-profit companies. And those for-profit companies are offering research services in most cases. These are private label journals. Generally speaking, they're going to publish short-term program output. Maybe the student worked 2 months, 3 months on their project. And generally, they're publishing quite a few literature reviews in these journals. There's nothing wrong with that, by the way. There's absolutely nothing wrong with a student publishing in these private label or junior science journals, as long as the student presents it that way when they apply to college or apply to jobs or speak to professors. So if they present it as, yeah, I published in this high school journal, I published my research in this high school journal, no problem. They're being very clear about what they did. The problem becomes when they present it as more than it is. So a student says, I presented, you know, I did this work and I published it in a scientific journal, when in fact, it was a private label journal owned by a company that's selling research slots, or it's actually been published in the Journal of High School Research. But they said, I published a scientific article. That can really hurt them. And please counsel your students strongly against this, both in their interviews and in their applications. I know that the ProPublica article said something like, we don't know. Let me tell you, we know. We know the difference. So really watch out for the claim here. The other claim I've seen by some high school students is that the science fair published their work. Again, no problem with that. I have published work at abstract, my abstracts from conferences, as long as it's presented that way. I, went to the science fair and they published my work in the Journal of the Science Fair. Perfectly reasonable and perhaps helpful. Just don't claim that it is more than it is, and don't let your students do that either. And I really want to emphasize this part, because I don't think the ProPublica article did this correctly. They said, well, the admissions office, maybe they know, maybe they don't know. For 2 years at my time at Duke, I was an associate director of undergraduate studies. I worked with the admissions department, and this is one of the things they asked me to do. They would show me a folder and they would say, is this publication really what it sounds like? And it happened all the time. That was part of my job. And I can absolutely tell you 100% if a student presented it as more than it was, that immediately knocked them down significantly and perhaps even out of admissions. So admissions definitely does know. Anyways, think about it. What a risky strategy. Risky was a strategy is you're going to try to fool the admissions department by claiming more than you have. That is a very risky strategy. So even if you don't believe me that the admissions department knows, you got to believe me that that's a bad idea to claim more than it is. So how do you figure out whether it really is what it is? It used to be a little bit easier than it was. First of all, in the sciences, that's my field. Well, let me back up first of all. First of all, a mentor will, this is what mentorship does. So if you have a full professor with a capital P as your mentor, they absolutely know. They know exactly which journal. This is our job. This is what we do. We used to say publish or perish in the tenure and promotion committee because you had to know this. This is exactly what you had to know. So if they have a mentor with a capital P, no problem. That person will help them and you don't need to worry anymore. That person will help them. If they do not, then you do need to worry. Some of the things you're looking for are, is the journal they selected archived? And that usually means indexed. Things like Google Scholar is okay. PubMed, Web of Science. These are archival or index companies that index journals. That's probably a good sign. It should definitely be peer reviewed. Watch out for anything that says preprint. Preprint is the opposite of peer review. You would think not peer reviewed would be the opposite of peer reviewed. That would make a lot of sense, but that's not what it is. Preprint is the opposite of peer reviewed. You definitely want the article to be peer reviewed for sure. Ideally, it should be international. In the old days, we used to have regional publications and national publications. That's really gone now. For the most part, all journals that you're publishing in should be international. Generally, that means English, but there actually are some excellent foreign language international journals. Should be independent, as I mentioned, not private labeled. Shouldn't be owned by the company selling research slots. That can be difficult to figure out, unfortunately. Generally speaking, they will not accept literature reviews. So if your student did an introductory program, meaning they did 8 weeks, 10 weeks, 12 weeks, something like that, they finished a literature review. That's what you finish after that in a good program. And that's generally not accepted in the kind of journal that the student's going to be looking for publication when a university says publication. Generally, they're expecting original data in most cases. One easy thing is if your student did a good literature review, they're going to have primary sources as their list of where they got their information. Is the journal on their list? If it is, that's a good sign that it is a science journal article. It's a main science journal. I just want to mention one other thing, which is not on this slide, which is impact factor. It used to be a really easy way to make this judgment. You could just look up impact factors. And there are still companies that publish good lists of impact factors. Unfortunately, like everything, it's become confusing. And now there are lousy listers of impact factor. So I don't recommend impact factor unless, of course, they have a mentor. If they have a mentor, the mentor will know which impact factor rating matters for evolutionary biology, for example. The mentor will definitely know that, and then you could be looking for a higher impact factor journal. All right, one more thing, I think, and then I'll just kind of review this, and then we'll dive into some details about IRI. I get quite a few questions about pay to play. I'll have to admit I don't quite understand the questions, but let me make the answer clear. I certainly understand the answer. If your student is paying, IRI, let's say, or another company to get research, that's fine. That should never come up in their applications. What they say in their application into college, what they say in their application is they were a lab assistant with Dr. Malkin at Duke University, or they were a lab research assistant, if that's what the title was, with Dr. Smith at Emory University. That's what matters. It's the experience the student had. It's not how they found that experience. Look, I mean, in your own life, if you get a job at Target, you don't put monster.com on your resume. You put Target because that's where you worked. You should be thinking about these organizations in the remote research space as placement agencies, including IRI. They don't get mentioned in the report. So there's no pay to play penalty from universities because they have no way of knowing. There should be no way for them to know that your client found the job through an agency. All right, I'm just going to kind of recap here, and then I'm going to stop talking. Key things to think about: mentorship. You're looking for a professor with a capital P, typical titles, and actually universal as far as I know: assistant, associate, and then full professor, which is just professor. Program type, introductory and advanced or in-depth. Don't worry so much about the name. If it's a short program, it's going to be introductory. It's going to be a year or two if it's an in-depth program. Format, group and individual, both are great. There's really not a reason to go with one another. Just remember there are limits. The faculty are not going to get to know their groups as well. Publication, this one is a tough one. Definitely if they have a mentor with a capital P, professor mentor, no problem. They can just work with their mentor and you can absolutely sleep soundly. If they're winging it on their own, there's a lot of pitfalls here, and really be careful that they're publishing it and claiming exactly what they have done. Don't let them claim outside of their accomplishment. And then referring to the work, as I said, don't refer to the placement agency, and then don't worry about pay to play. All right, so that's it for me. I'm going to ask you to pass it over to our director at IRI to talk a little bit about IRI in specifics. Angie?
Thank you. Yeah, let's talk a little bit about IRI and let's understand the opportunity that we're offering your students right here, right now. So as you all know by now, we offer remote research opportunities for high school students, for your students. And as we're speaking, we still have some opening spots for the summer. So if you still have some students that might be interested in this, there's still a chance for them to join. We have rolling admissions, but we can talk a little bit about that later. For now, let's talk about why they should join IRI. And the thing about IRI is that since we've been reviewing all of this complicated or gray areas where you should be very careful, here at IRI, we make sure we are covered. So we are working directly with amazing faculty from the US, from world-class universities. So they're going to be with those capital P professors if they join IRI. And if they join the more advanced program, the one that takes about 2 years, we can think about publication. We will continue to support your students until they are done with their paper and will be publishing in a scientific, peer-reviewed, indexed journal. We will not be publishing in a white label or high school journal. Now, regarding how universities will see the applications and the applicants and the work they've been doing with us, this could be a very interesting opportunity for your students because they will see the application and the student as more qualified, and their application will be stronger. This is a long extracurricular if they choose the long one, or another cool extracurricular they could be doing, a great differentiator. They can get letters of recommendation if they do a great job from our capital P professors. And they can also get the human subject research certificate if they are researching in that field, which is extra academic work that a lot of high school students do not have. And finally, the publication, which is of course the big one, which shows determination, clarity of thought, and curiosity, as well as that very important passion project we all know about, right? So as I said, we mostly have two main programs, the Intro to Research program and the Research Assistant program. For the Research Assistant program, they're going to be working directly with those capital P professors, like Dr. Malkin said, 1 hour per week, working one-to-one, and they're going to have support from the graduate mentors as well. They're going to attend lab meetings, get to know the professor and build that connection and work towards that publication. For the Intro to Research program, those students that maybe are starting to think if this whole researching thing is interesting for them, it's a shorter program with less time per week. So they can choose a 4-week program or an 8-week program, which is perfect for the summer, but we actually offer this program all through the year. They complete a literature review based on a question on something that they find very interesting. And they're going to be mostly working with graduate students to help them through the process, but they will continue to have sessions and time with their capital P professors. So here we have a visual of the programs, because sometimes it's easier to see that. We have the research assistant program, and we see that we're talking about multiple terms, and it's only an individual program. Then we have the second cluster, the intro to research program, and we have that program in different formats. We have an individual, we have a group program, and we have the express, which is the 4-week version. Maybe this image will make it clearer for you, so feel free to screenshot this, or you can check it out at our webpage. So here we have some of our faculty, some of our capital P professors that are supporting our students. Now, it would take me a long time to show you exactly what they're up to and how they are supporting our students, but I just want you to see the different fields. Now, for the research assistant program, the students will join their lab. Therefore, the projects and the available projects we have are very specific. For the intro program, they can choose different fields and different interests, but for the research, they have to be matched with the right faculty. So we have Dr. Mills, Dr. Talon, and so many interesting and amazing educators. For us, it's not just about finding the best in their fields, but also about finding the best educators, because as you know, high school students have very specific needs when it comes to that education. More amazing faculty from different universities and very exciting different programs. So what's going to happen next? If you think that this could be a very interesting opportunity for your students, you can direct them to apply. We have openings available, like I said, and some summer spots still there for them. Rolling admissions all through the year, and we start the programs every 2 weeks. If you have any questions, you can contact us at admissions@iri-nc.org, or you can just go to our website and find our application form and get the program started. If you have any questions, you can contact me or you can contact Dr. Malkin, and we will be here to help you and guide you. Thank you so much.